Welcome to the Home Builder Digital Marketing Podcast. Over 90% of today's home buyers start their buyer journey online. Here we talk with not only industry experts, but also your fellow home builder marketers to learn how you can succeed in our incredibly competitive digital world. And now, here are your hosts, Greg Bray and Kevin Weitzel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Home Builder Digital Marketing Podcast. I'm Greg Bray with Blue Tangerine.
And I'm Kevin Weitzel with Outhouse.
And we are excited to have joining us on the show today, Dennis O'Neill. Dennis is the president of O'Neill Interactive. Welcome, Dennis. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks very much, Greg. Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to join the group here.
So, Dennis, for those who may not know you, which is probably a very small list of our listeners, but let's give them that quick background and introduction of who you are and what you've been doing.
My pleasure. My name is Dennis O'Neill. I started O'Neill Interactive coming up on 16 years ago now. We are a digital focused group, primarily known for website design and development in the home building industry. We work specifically and exclusively in the home building industry, including my background before then. It's an industry I've been a part of for, I'm aging myself, but 20 plus years now. It's one that we all feel very closely connected to and enjoy. So these are my people here, Greg and Kevin. This is my people, right? This is just home building technology. This is what we do.
Well, Dennis, Greg and I have known you for quite some time, so we know a little bit more about the personal side of you. But could you do me a favor and take off your president hat, take off your website hat, take off the fact that you work in the home building industry, and give us a personal factoid about you that people will learn about on our podcast?
I'm a bit more than a coffee snob. I have trouble accepting bad coffee and will try to be polite and courteous should I be given bad coffee. But I have a strong preference for good, fresh, ground and brewed espresso. And that is my coffee of choice, and I drink it all day. Many, many, many servings of espresso every single day. So I keep going. I saw that little prep question, to be honest, and it's always a hard time thinking, well, what am I other than home building, digital, and websites, right? It's so much a definition of what I do every day. But yeah, that's something that is at least not digital. It's very much a manual process. But
so I have to follow up with any sleep issues.
Yeah, I don't sleep very much. Yeah, but that was even before the espresso addiction. But yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, Dennis, tell us a little bit more about how you got started in the home building industry and what kind of attracted you to working in this space.
So my first month in the building industry was January of 2000. I owe my introduction to the building industry to a friend. I had an interest or sort of maybe a predisposition towards home building and architecture and to just design in general. In high school, I thought I wanted to be an architect. And then I found out what college for architects cost. So that didn't end up working out. But believe it or not, in the late 90s, I was in the car business. Sold new cars for several years. In the last couple of years of selling new cars, I was actually an online sales counselor for new cars. So this was in the late 90s. And I had a close friend who was working on the sales floor, and he happened to sell a minivan to the wife of the VP in sales and marketing for Ryland Homes in Baltimore. Thankfully, the wife said, my husband needs to meet you. This is my friend Patrick was his name. So lo and behold, my friend gets hired off, goes to work for Ryland in new home sales, kept in touch, asked him how it was going. He said he loved it. 8 months later, he said, hey, you interested in changing jobs, changing your career? So I went for the interview, and that was that. Started in January 2000 as a new home sales trainee. Was there for a couple months, obviously, at least a couple months of training you have to go through and then become a new home salesperson. So I was selling pretty much through, well, if you guys remember the, like 2004, 2005 market was fantastic. So it was right about that time that I decided to become a sales manager so I could earn less money. So I feel like as soon as things got crazy, right? Like around that time, if you guys remember that time was just, everything was on fire. When I started, I remember my first sale. It was a single buyer buying a townhouse, and he locked his interest rate at a 9% fixed FHA, which was a good rate. And then things just went bizarre, right? Just totally berserk for a while. I was a selling sales manager for my last 4 years with Ryland. And then about 2008, that was also a different time in the market. That was when I started O'Neill Interactive. That's a whole nother story, which I could keep talking
Well-
about. I didn't want to keep talking about the same story, but that's how I found myself to where I am today.
And not home builder related, but if you were selling cars in the late 90s, that
Mhm.
means that you were in a transitional period, not only when they were developing what they called BDCs in the car side, what
Mhm.
we call OSCs, but BDC centers, business development centers and call
Yeah.
centers.
Mhm.
But you were also in when the dealerships were actually having to change how they paid their employees. It went from a very commission centric pay scale to where the auto manufacturers were pulling back and only paying dealerships a sliver of the profit and then giving it all back to them on the back end called holdback money, which
Mhm.
basically robbed the floor sales guys the ability to be able to eat,
Yeah.
really, because
Yeah.
it took away their percentage of profit. So you saw that change.
Yeah, because in my earliest years of the new home sales, or this, I mean, new home sales, say habit, mental, in new car sales, you were paid on the gross profit. So I was on the floor for about a year and a half. I did it for about 3 total years. The last year and a half, this was, as you mentioned, it was not just the transition in time when the sort of the pay or the gross was different, but the internet was making an incredible impact on the buying process at that point. I've always had a sort of a technical nature or predisposition anyway. So I was very interested in communicating with that buyer and trying to help the dealership basically accommodate the buyer and not be so combative. And that was a very sort of frustrating time for a lot of car salespeople because they were losing their power. Their power was information. That's basically where they derived their value from. If you were not an internet user and you wanted to know what colors a car came in, you had to go to the dealership and pick up a brochure or talk to a salesperson or call. All of a sudden, the internet was taking that away from them. They were no longer able to stand in front of the information and say, "Hi, Mr. Customer, you have to talk to me now." So they were just really freaking out about it. That's not your value as a salesperson. That's not where salespeople derive their value add to the transaction. It's about knowing the customer and being able to understand and answer questions that they couldn't answer just from reading a sentence or a paragraph in a brochure. So it was a very interesting time in the car industry. That dealership had 5 locations and different manufacturers. So at the time I was there, we didn't have a word for it. I don't remember what I called it. It might have been called internet sales manager, internet salesperson. But I took the leads for the 5 dealerships and farmed the leads. And then I had a salesperson contact at each dealership. And that's who I introduced them to and set appointments for.
I'm confused, Dennis, because for a second there, I thought you were talking about home building right now, but you're still talking about car dealerships then, right? This whole internet thing, this fad that's happening now, that's like putting more information in the buyer's hands. Was I confused, or which time period were you talking about?
You're absolutely right. It definitely hit the car industry first because in terms of like scale of sale, right? Like what the average buyer spends or the average consumer spends money on, next to the home, the car is probably the most popular, second highest expense that people buy. No one, even today, even having been in a year, I can't stand going to a car dealership. You don't know what you're going to get. It's the luck of the draw, the salesperson that walks up to you. And I was in it for years and I still can't stand. I think it makes me even less likely to withstand or just deal with the standard circles, like, oh, now we're going to sit and wait for the finance guy. Okay. Like I hate that. I hate that. So, and they see me rolling my eyes. I know they do.
Well, let me ask you kind of a weird question then. This is a little bit out of left field, but and I've said this before on various panels and stuff, but the auto industry has a ridiculous advantage over home builders in the fact that not only were they first to market with a lot of things, but they have whole groups of dealerships that have to foot the bill to pay for this new fancy website. So when Honda decides that, hey, we're going to roll out this new website and here's how financing is going to roll, here's how the credit process is going to go, and here's where all the models are, and here's how you look at availability. Every Honda dealer, all 2,000, 20,000, however many there are across the country, all have to pay for that collectively through their dealer ownership. Home builders don't have that benefit. They all have to kind of go to bat with their own boxing gloves on and figure out how they're going to pay for it. So
Yeah.
what are solutions that you're coming up with to possibly help home builders defray some of that isms that come with it?
That's a great question. I think it's an interesting sort of challenge. I think that same lines of the fact that car dealers, there's only so many manufacturers, right? But there's lots of dealerships. Whereas with home building, every single home builder is their own manufacturer. They might use the same parts as some of the other builders or some of the same parts, right? But they still have to sort of figure out how to sell, brand, and market their own assembly version of that product and where they put it. To that extent, I think it goes to some of the questions of like, well, what should you do in-house versus what should you look outside to do? The largest builders who maybe have the expertise and the budget, makes sense to do as much in-house as you can, with some exceptions. Otherwise, it's thinking about like, what do you need a thing to do? What is a thing's purpose? What is a service's purpose? What problem is it solving for you or your buyers? And then if it's something where the better solution exists outside because of the fact that some company, like all of the ones that we represent here amongst ourselves, us three, have the ability to build a better solution because we have this sort of collective of builders that needed it. We see a hole, we see something that every builder needs. Well, we can build a solution and scale it across 20, 30, 50, hundreds of builders. And it's a more powerful solution that any builder alone could build for themselves. As you know, with technology, it's not just about building a solution, it's about maintaining a solution. It's about making sure that it works next year, next month, on the next iPhone, that it's compatible with the next watch, the next version of Chrome doesn't blow it up and make it stop working, right? Like all of those things come into play.
Wait a minute. Greg, Dennis, I need to pose this to both of you because I was under the impression that you could build a website and it just goes on and forever. Perpetuity. That's not the case. You have to maintain these things. That's crazy.
Well, you know, the original Space Jam website is still available from what I understand. I think it was originally, like a couple of years ago it was.
To that point, I think builders are starting to understand that in a new way, that it's not just about, gosh, I need to do a new one every so often, but there's like daily, weekly, monthly things that need to happen to keep that stuff up to date, and they start to feel it when their tool set doesn't support them very well to make that happen. Would you agree, Dennis?
I would. And I admit, coming from me, a lot of times I'll preface it when I talk to a builder and I say, well, I realize I'm coming from a biased position. I said, but in my mind, a website is never finished. It is not. Customer expectations don't stop getting bigger because you press the launch button on your website. They're constantly looking for something different, and there is better ways to do things. Sometimes there's a better way to do things because we learn something different about consumer behavior, or there's a better way to do things because consumers have been trained by a popular behavior that this is the way things are supposed to happen. And we need to be able to accommodate that workflow. Everything else doesn't stop changing around it. The tools that consumers use to access the internet and store and save their information. We used to be worried, sometimes we still are, but we used to be really worried about what pages looked like when they were printed. That's really not that much of a concern anymore, right? There are still some exceptions, but generally speaking, that's not a number one concern, right? But people were concerned about that before they were concerned about what does it look like on the new iPhone. Very different. Times change, tech changes.
And I would say, Dennis, that idea of the website's never done, I've seen occasionally, not too often, but occasionally it gets in the way of actually finishing anything, where we just keep going and going. We need to try this a different way or try this a different way instead of getting I don't want to call it good enough, but version 1 or version 2 out the door and let version 3 come later instead of trying to get it all perfect.
100% is kind of that blocker of thinking about the website as a static brochure. If anyone is used to sort of approving a catalog, a brochure, like a multi-page document, you know, if you've ever been in charge of sort of pre-proofing, something like that, everything does have to be perfect before you print it because you can't change the ones that are already printed, you know, so you're spending thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars printing something. And yeah, once it's done, but that's the beauty of the web, right? It's not that way. Kanye West was releasing edits to his music in one of the last albums, like after he released the music. The songs were changing after he already published them. And the other versions were gone. He just changed them, just like the web. I mean, that's what things are sort of revolving into. Websites have been there for ages. So I absolutely agree with you. We have to sort of help people break free of that mindset of, well, we can't go live until that one picture's changed. That's not really true. You can. It's okay.
I have 3,000 records, and I don't know who's this person. Is Kanye person?
I'm not really sure. I heard about him on Twitter. I'm not really.
Oh, somewhere on Twitter. Okay. No, okay. So I'm going to need Greg to take off his interviewer hat and put on an interviewee hat because I have a question that just honestly just drives me bonkers, and I want to field it to both of you. It basically comes down to this because you said a very interesting word, page. A lot of people still build websites using like a WordPress where it's all page-based. I don't think that it's necessarily long in the tooth or it's run its course, but with all the data interchange and interface, is that even still the best option for a home builder? Could you guys expound on just that topic just for a little bit? Because everybody knows I'm not a computer nerd, but I do understand the topical aspect of it. So could you guys expound, please?
Go ahead, Dennis.
I think probably that what you described, Kevin, is a common sort of mindset that we have to often help people sort of break out of thinking of their website as a document layout exercise. In that the fact that most of the content that exists on most builder pages is dynamic. in the sense that if a builder has 50 communities, 30 communities, 300 communities, the process to construct, quote unquote, the website, I'm doing air quotes like there's video here. The process to construct a website is not, oh, let's start with community A, and then we're going to go to community B, and then pretty soon we're going to get the market X. There's not a one-by-one process. It is a building sort of a dynamic structure of where content will go. And then we load the content into a database that then dynamically populates that same sort of visual. So it is a different thing to think about. The idea of previewing a website is not about visually looking at every single page like you're flipping through and proofing a print catalog. It's a matter of approving a structure and understanding that it's going to look different for every single one because the content's going to be different for every single one. Some of them might have 1 or 2 photos and it doesn't look as great as the one that have 30 photos. But the thing to do is not to redesign the page for the 1 or 2 photos. The thing is to get them all to have 30 photos. It's sort of a different way of looking at what the final product is. And sometimes the deficiencies or what might be perceived as deficiencies in the presentation is really more of an indicator of content deficiencies. So Greg, I would imagine you've seen some of the same kind of things.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It's like, this will look much better if you had all the content instead of some of it. But Kevin, you used the word WordPress. I want to be clear. I don't think WordPress is a bad word. Okay. I think there's a place for it. It's certainly part of the fabric of the internet. It drives so many sites, but I, in my heart, believe home builder sites are different because of this data and content that Dennis was describing. When you start to talk about the relationship between locations and communities and models and floor plans and inventory homes and elevations and prices and all of these things that come together from a data standpoint, a page-oriented structure like WordPress is typically out of the box. It's not to say you couldn't build something underneath that custom, and people have, right? But in general, you see most agencies that builders work with that are doing WordPress, they're not doing that. They are doing page-oriented stuff, and you start to get duplicate stuff that you have to keep up to date. You can't export it out to send it to like other listing platforms. You can't integrate with your in-office ERP system to update pricing or whatever. All of these things get in the way because this data is so critical to how builders think and work. And they don't even realize how unique that is compared to most business websites.
You just uncorked 2 different problems, all in the same statement. You've got not only the import of all the ERP information that has to be able to feed dynamically that information, but you've got the Zillows, the Realtor.coms of the world, the Livables, where that data has to be pushed out to in real time so they can stay relevant and on point.
Dennis, would you be comfortable saying that home builders are different than kind of the typical website if you were just working in some other industry?
1000%. Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you that I have great respect for WordPress. We've leveraged it many years ago. Like you said, it powers something ridiculous, like 18% of the internet, or maybe it's even more than that now, but it does power some ridiculous percentage of the internet. But it is not really great and best suited for high volume content and flexibility. While it's infinitely more flexible than it used to be, ultimately it was designed as a blog platform and it eventually sort of grew into what it is now. You wouldn't think that a builder has greatly complex data, just from a pedestrian view. I would totally agree with that. Like I would never think that the home building industry has a complex data set and the set of rules and how things work together. But I can tell you that it does. And then I can tell you that every builder also has different ways that they choose to treat that data. There are lots of business practices and business policies that influence even how different builders treat the same content. And that kind of flexibility we have found well beyond the complexity that WordPress is designed to support. So I'm of the same opinion. Some builders have made it work for them, and that's great. We have been able to get much more mileage. I know you have too, Greg, out of solutions other than WordPress to be able to meet the needs of the builder.
It really gets down into, I think it's a pros and cons thing. It's not necessarily a right or wrong. There's a cost here or there's a cost there, and you've got to kind of figure out. I don't want somebody listening to this going, oh, shoot, we just did a WordPress website. I'm going to get fired, because there's some builders out there that have done some good things with WordPress. But I think that there are some cons that they may not have recognized early on, especially if the agency that was building it for them isn't as familiar with some of these other use cases. And then they start to run into some of that and they go, wait a minute, I've had you probably have too, Dennis, builders come and say, hey, we have this great WordPress thing and we need to get a feed out to Zillow or somebody like
Right.
that. And it's like, I can't do that for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I can't.
there's no magic tool that scrapes everything off of WordPress and turns it into a Zillow feed. It just
Yeah.
doesn't happen, right? Yeah, totally get it. I've had the exact same conversation. Just like you said, WordPress is great in a lot of ways. A lot of the questions or requests that we've gotten over the years, they originate from somebody using WordPress because they do have a lot of great tools. Their WYSIWYG editor is really good. The what you see is what you get editor that's in the dashboard. They've got really simple ways that people are used to being able to add plugins for functionality, good tools to be able to just copy and paste in a YouTube link and then have it turn into a video. So there's definitely some things I think that we can learn from WordPress in terms of dashboard and user experience. But ultimately, when you see someone who is used to building in WordPress and you see the product that they build for a builder from a website perspective, oftentimes they are very good. But like to your point, Greg, there's that step of like not being able to foresee this other need and not understanding that, oh, well, actually, you're going to need to go here, but you're also going to want this data to do this. So it really should be sort of separate or allocated differently. These are things I'm speaking about vaguely because I didn't want to get too nerdy with examples, but technical things. But there are things that need to happen. You know what our clients are going to ask for, right? You know what the builders need. We have seen it. You organize it differently. WordPress is, back to your point, Kevin, I guess I'll say, it sort of has that page by page sort of mentality about how things are maintained, not big structure with fill it in with dynamically with content.
It's a great informational magazine, not necessarily a plug and play computer where you can actually feed other platforms with it.
Yes.
Safe layman's assessment.
I think so.
Well, let me pivot to this. Let's pivot to some mistakes you've seen. Besides, and the one that's off limits, you can't use this one, is people that have built a website and then set it, forget it, and didn't do anything to it for 5 to 10 years. That one's off limits. What other mistakes have you seen out there, Dennis, that home builders have done?
Well, we already use WordPress too, so I guess I can't use that one again either, right? I'll just put WordPress maybe under the whole sort of wrong platform scenario. I can lump some others in there, which maybe are not as good as WordPress, like Squarespace and, smaller builders that are just getting started, of course, that are just using something really simple and static like that. I think maybe the ones that rely on outside companies to do their website. And by that, I mean like realtors. And this is a problem typically that is more for builders that are just starting to grow, getting accomplished, where they have basically abdicated the majority of their responsibility for any website content to realtors and MLSs. And they just have sort of a basic iframe on their website where they're importing some listings from a real estate agent, where they essentially have zero control over their data or the presentation of their data. I'd say that's a big one. I mean, on the flip side of things, the ones that's maybe a little bit easier to come back from is the website that has 100 things, every new shiny tool bolted onto it. I'd say that's probably another one.
I've seen that.
Yeah, because it's very easy and fun to chase shiny tools, right? It just, not all of them are ready for prime time. That's all. So I think we've seen both in this point where you've seen like there's 15 different chat bubbles that sort of pop up at any given different moment because somebody's using a combination of like unbounced modals and a chat bot, and then also a reminder thing and a request for notifications. And, you're like clicking off 7 things before you can actually read the content of the website. And that's because the builders are trying to do everything they can that they've been told at some point or another was, hey, this is a good thing. When in fact, not everything is ready. Not everything is ready. It has to fit into a holistic strategy and think about consumer experience too.
Dennis, on that list of mistakes, what are you seeing with builders who say, okay, I need a website. I know I need a website. It needs to perform. But then they hesitate to make some of the investments after the site's live for things, say, SEO or other types of promotional activities online that really drive that traffic. The whole build it and they will come mentality that I think is a little dated, if I dare say so. Are you running into that still, or are builders finally getting it, in your opinion?
I think it's more common that they get it now for sure. I hope nobody still believes the build it and they come actually ever existed in reality, except maybe in the beginning when there just weren't enough websites to satisfy people's needs. But I think we're there, right? I think volume of websites necessary has been achieved. Now it's about trying to find or surface the better ones, right? We do try to talk to builders about that often, even before we've been engaged to build something new for somebody. We try to encourage them to think long-term. We talk about lots of ideas, and a good percentage of ideas can't make it into, what we call launch version. There's a lot of things that builders that are on the wish lists, a lot of things that builders would like to do We also encourage them not to try to do everything all at one time, even though that we could do everything for them at one time. Most of the time, their business processes need to change or be altered to even be able to accommodate some of the things that they want to do and we recommend they do. Trying to do all of that at once is normally a recipe for failure. So we normally try to encourage them to phase things in, which also involves an acknowledgement that we're going to keep building. We're going to build the site, it's going to launch, and then we're going to keep going. And we're going to go into phase 2 and then phase 3 and phase 4. And we might add in a 3.5 and a 2.7 and then whatever comes along the way. But it's thankfully, I think, getting more and more common to understand it's a forever process. It really is.
You brought up actually a pretty interesting point that I want, a little tangent that I want to take on that.
Mhm.
And that is that people want their websites to do everything.
Mm.
However, how realistic is it with a lot of the builders that you run into that they even have the infrastructure, the back end to be able to feed the beast that would be that website that can sell online, they can reserve online, they can do everything they want it to do? I mean, all these disconnected pieces they have to be able to connect.
Mhm.
How are you seeing that folding into reality?
So it is still a conversation we have pretty often in the sense that I think, well, we were on that panel, the Buy Online panel a couple of years ago, right, at the Builder Show. That was the flavor of the month back then. Don't hear people ask many questions about Buy Online today. Things change, right? But at the time, we had many of those conversations. I'll lean on that as an example that at that time, everybody wanted to be able to have somebody go through the cart checkout process, sign a contract, leave a deposit, and reserve a lot and do all of those things via the website. We had and still have the infrastructure to support that. We have some clients that implemented it and still have it. But I will say that the biggest sort of obstacle that we had for builders was not thinking through the rest of the process or sort of like not realizing that they needed to be prepared or that more than the marketing department needed to be involved in the conversation. The marketing people were obviously the folks that we work with and the folks that are coming to us, sales and marketing team, about we want this now, when can we have it? And we're like, you can have it tomorrow. However, here's the other things that you probably want to involve in the conversation. Has someone approved this process for deposits? Is this acceptable in your state for mortgage deposits? Can you do earnest money with a credit card in your area? Will banks accept that? And does your controller realize that if we do ACH, that there's a 30-day chargeback period and that you shouldn't accept an ACH within 30 days of closing because that consumer could still go pull that money back even after they closed? So like all of these things that we sort of had to talk through with the builders, unfortunately, many of them hit roadblocks that they were just not able to overcome. For those kind of large structural process transaction changes, they need to corral the leadership and get everybody on the same page and acknowledge the changes that the company's going to have to make to be able to accommodate those. So when a builder's up for it and you've got a marketing head or a sales and marketing head that is ready for that, then it's great. But still one thing at a time, because you're also not going to convince your production team and the financial department to make 7 changes all at once, coordinated with the website launch date. It's a process. Larger organization, more layers of approval, more people involved. So it is possible. I don't by any means want to say all of that and discourage anyone from trying. If anything, I'm hoping that more people are up for the challenge, because I think in the long run, it's a necessity. Think of it as a disadvantage for the larger established companies and an advantage for the ones that don't have a process yet, because they can make the process work. They can build their company around the process that works the way consumers want to buy.
That's aircraft carrier versus PT boat mentality.
There you go. Yeah.
It takes 13 people to steer an aircraft carrier. It takes one person to make a decision to turn the wheel in a PT boat.
There's also a technology leapfrogging effect too, right? When you think about cell phones, the countries that never had landlines because they were just behind, and then cell phones came along and all of a sudden everything's cell phone. But in the US, we lagged behind because we had this big infrastructure we still had to pay for and leverage and use for many years. And I see kind of what you're talking about. This whole idea, Dennis, that buy online was so in the conversation just a couple of years ago. And I've been pondering that a little bit myself, like, why did it go away? Right? Why did it go away? And I think some of it was the pandemic pressures eased up. There was some COVID pressure to try new things, some focus on some of that. And we've been able to kind of go back to the good old way of selling because of that. But I think some of those roadblocks you talked about, also people like went, oh, this is harder than I thought. I think the buyers though changed during COVID. And I don't think they've said it's fine. Oh, sorry, there's a roadblock. We still want it. They want to interact online. I think
Yeah.
people that learned how to buy groceries during COVID on the website who had never done it before, they may not do it as much, but when they're in a pinch, they like knowing they can go buy groceries online and get it delivered and not have to mess with it. Buyer behavior has evolved. And if builders just say, oh, never mind, we can all go back, I think we're going to be in for a rude awakening pretty soon if we don't keep trying to solve some of those barriers. Thoughts?
Yeah. That's an excellent observation. I would have to agree with. We got this sort of dam of pressure that built up because there were a lot of things that couldn't happen the old way. Even if consumers wanted it beforehand, the acknowledgement was during COVID, things were still locked down and people still weren't coming out as freely in some places. And we had this sort of like, we have to go this way. We have to do buy online because it is our only way that we can continue selling and doing things. People were sort of predicting it. Obviously, we were selling lots of homes during the pandemic, but we were looking for everything possible to make it easier to happen because we were anticipating things potentially getting harder. And maybe we were missing some of the market. And maybe buy online would give us a competitive advantage over the other builders that didn't do it. Now, that's still up for debate. But what happened is when that roadblock went away of like, oh, you can open again. We can do business in person. You can come out. We can just email you the contract. We'll just take your deposit this way. When all that opened and got to be available again, all the pressure, that sort of internal drive from the sales and marketing leaders that said we need to do buy online, it's not our biggest problem anymore. It's back to over here. And I think everybody just started looking in a different direction. That's why we don't really hear much of a conversation anymore. But I agree with you, Greg. It's still here. The consumer's mind hasn't changed. I mean, we were talking about how the consumers have always wanted to buy online and thrilled that everybody was talking about it a couple of years ago, right? But it's not priority one for any builder that I know right now. It's not. And it's kind of shocking, really, when you think about it, how many builders had made it priority one during that time period. And some of them accomplished phase 1, 2, maybe something like that, maybe hadn't gotten all the way to phase 3, but some of them got a little far, but nobody's really focused on that as their number one thing right now. I mean, problems have changed, and unfortunately we tend to be, I think, a little bit too reactive in the industry at times, which is some of what creates our problems, right? A little bit too reactive.
Well, Dennis, we appreciate the time you spent with us. Just a couple of thoughts to get from you before we kind of wrap up. You have the opportunity to talk to a lot of builders and to look at a lot of marketing plans and ideas and things. And when you get invited in to say, gosh, we need help, what are those first few things that you start asking about or looking at? It's kind of that core foundation of, okay, if we need to sell more homes, get more leads, what are some of those first things that you look for to see if it's broken or okay?
I'd say it's really 3, and one of them is sort of a subcategory that's related to both. I'm looking for data on leads and sales, the origin of leads and the origin of sales, and sales volume by community, right? So sometimes you're trying to rule out, is it a sales problem or a marketing problem? That's the leads to sales ratio component. But then also I'm looking for leads and leads by source. But throughout the whole time that I'm looking at that, I'm looking at the integrity of the data, which oftentimes is where the ability in my mind to do a perfect audit, which doesn't really exist, but to do a great audit requires data integrity. Unfortunately, most of the time we deal with the data we have, right? But almost immediately, there's always opportunities to improve the quality and the consistency of the data. You can't have a lead report and says, well, this is all of our leads and it does include everything. Well, except for Tuesday, because on Tuesday, Bob takes the leads and he's not great about entering stuff. That's not a report then, right? There's no integrity there in that data. So oftentimes my very initial conversations come to leads and sales and looking at where you see holes and gaps in those and opportunities, not investing in this channel, over investing in another channel, geographic differences in results and sort of outcome based upon investments. But almost always there are significant notes on how to ensure quality data, because you can only make the recommendations based on the data that you actually have. Whether or not it's accurate or not, you don't really know. You just sort of have to take for benefit. But almost always there's ways to improve the quality and accuracy of the data that gets collected. I think just in general, and I'm speaking broadly, there are some builders that do a great job, but just as an overall sort of general feedback, I think the industry has a lot of improvement opportunities in terms of consistency of data, interoperability of data. Can we layer this over that? Can we look for correlations between these two statistics? we should be able to do that. Home building industries are huge, really. When you think about revenue per capita, by that I mean like revenue for a company as compared to the number of employees. Home builders are, I don't know enough about other industries to be absolutely honest to be able to say that. But if you think about revenue per employee, it's huge, right? When you think about that kind of scale, and I'm not saying that that means that there's tons of money everywhere and they should spend every single dime they have on data. I think we underinvest in what we could learn. And part of it probably goes back to some of what you had mentioned, Kevin, is just that every builder operates with their own product line. There's not a lot of benefit to sort of sharing, like best practices and tools, but I think they have the benefit of that PT boat, right? I've never heard of the word innovation and committee work together in the right sentence. They just don't, right? If you want to be an innovator, if you want to be a leader, if you want to create something new, then being the PT boat, at the very least, it's the mentality you want to have, even if it's not the reality of the size. Working like that gives you the ability to move faster.
Well, Dennis, any last words of advice for helping builders with their marketing that you wanted to leave with our audience today?
SEO is technical again. Just a heads up. It doesn't mean content's gone away, but for years, the conversation around SEO has been content and quality, and content is king. But SEO is technical again. Pay attention to website performance, speed, and Google's tool set around core web vitals. All those things are important. It's coming back in a big way. So pay attention, ask your web developer for data.
Great thoughts, great advice. Well, Dennis, if somebody wants to connect with you and reach out, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
The best way is email. It's just Dennis, DENNIS @o'neillinteractive.com.
All right. Well, thank you again for being with us today. And thank you everybody for listening to the Home Builder Digital Marketing Podcast. I'm Greg Bray with Blue Tangerine.
And I'm Kevin Weitzel with Outhouse. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about how Blue Tangerine and Outhouse can help you generate more qualified home buyer leads, visit bluetangerine.com and outhouse.net. If you've enjoyed our show today, please tell a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to join us again on the Home Builder Digital Marketing Podcast.